Hello and welcome to the Field Guides. Bill Michaelek here, and you're listening to part 2 of our field trip to the Roger Tory Peterson Institute in Jamestown, New York. If you haven't listened to part 1, I suggest you check that one out first. In it, we spoke with Arthur Pearson, CEO of the Institute, who filled us in on Peterson's background, the work of the Institute, and we also discussed some history of field guides and their influence on conservation. In this episode, we head out on the trail with Twan Leenders, the Institute's Senior Director of Science and Conservation. Twan grew up in the Netherlands, and he went on to have a career in conservation that deserves to be made into a movie. From the treetops of Central American rainforests, to writing field guides on the wildlife of Costa Rica, to capturing spiny softshell turtles in post-industrial rivers, Twan's stories, as well as his personal philosophy on science communication, it makes for a fascinating listen. So stick around as Steve and I set out on a rainy summer morning with Twan. Enjoy. All right, folks, so as you can hear, we are back outside, and we're here with Twan Leenders. Hello, Twan.
Hi, how are you?
And Twan, just to give people an idea, what's your job title?
I'm the Senior Director of Science and Conservation at the Roger Tory Peterson Institute.
All right.
I'm still on the fence about the senior part, because I don't feel that old.
Now, before we start this next section of the podcast, folks, I wanted to read a little passage for you. In my research, I did come across some scientific articles, but I also came across just some written passages, contemplations about field guides. And there was an author I came across called Diana Capel-Smith, who I'd never heard of. Have either of you guys ever heard of her?
Nope.
So she published a few books of nature essays, I believe from the 90s, the early 2000s. And there was one piece that she wrote for a journal called The American Scholar. Now, unfortunately, the article's behind a paywall, so most people aren't able to access it. I probably illegally printed out a few copies for the staff here, just because I wanted to share it because it was so beautiful. Capel-Smith wrote about her relationship with her Peterson wildflower field guide. She started out the article talking about how when she was 11 years old, her family was vacationing in Maine, and they were taken on a nature hike at a local nature center. And she said that she imagines in her memory that the leader was a young man, and she was probably a little bit smitten with him, and she pointed out a wildflower, and he looked at it for a second and said, that's just an aster.
Just an aster, yeah. And I'm still pretty impressed if that's actually what he said.
And this is what she wrote, just taking how she describes the aster. And I remember the aster. Its rays were a brilliant purple, its core a dense coin of yellow velvet. It focused light as a crystal will. It faced the sun, rigid with delight. It was the sun's echo.
I love it.
But this is the part. So then she goes on. She says, later that day, a book with a green cover lay on the arm of an Adirondack chair under an apple tree. It was the same volume that our guide had carried as he marched us through the woods. Everyone who had been on the walk had gone into the nature center for milk and cookies, and the book had been left there by itself. It was a thing of power, as totemic in its way as an orb and scepter. In the thin summer shadow of the tree, quivering like a veil, green on green on green, the book was revealed, and I reached for it. A field guide to wildflowers, Peterson and McKenney, its cover said. Its backside was ruled like a measuring tape. Its inside was full of drawings of flowers, and by the end of that week, I had my own copy. I have it still.
That's great.
So, folks, if you can get your hands on it, it is a beautiful piece, and she just goes on, and she perfectly captures those first frustrating times trying to figure out what a wildflower is. She's hiking with friends, and she comes across a yellow flower. So she flips to the yellow section. She's like, no, those leaves aren't quite right. And, oh, nope, that flower, just the petals don't look quite right. And just how eventually that field guide is your window to becoming, I know you love it when I say this, becoming friends with the wildlife around you, right?
Yeah.
And I really like how she compares the aster to the sun.
Right.
Because not only are they called sunflowers, that's obvious, but the word aster actually derives from a word for the sun, right? So,
and having read some of her other stuff, I'm pretty sure she did that on purpose.
Right, and I was thinking she could have done it on purpose, but it also could have been such an easy coincidence to make, just because of the way we talk about it. But it really does get its name from the sun. Yeah.
Now, Twan, before we turned on the mic, I told you that I was going to do my little intro here, and then I was going to have you give us background. But could you start your background by telling us, do you remember what your first field guide was?
I do actually. So I was born and raised in the Netherlands, far, far away from here. And I grew up in the country on what used to be my grandfather's farm. Farm burned down. It was one of these old European, 16th century farms.
Did you
burned
wear
down.
wooden shoes?
I did not, and I did not eat tulips either, even if people always ask me.
I'm sorry. It was too obvious. I had to.
But I grew up in the country, and it's really farmland, and if anybody's familiar with the Netherlands, it's about, half the size of New York State and packed with people and very little nature. Every square inch has been shoveled over and fought over and battled over.
You can say that about most of
centuries.
Europe, right?
It's about the same.
I mean, a lot of America deforested.
It's true,
yeah.
isn't it? I know
Yeah.
people don't really realize that, but how much human interference has already taken place by the time we get there and see it. So it looks like nature to us, especially as a kid,
Right.
but it's really not. It is and it isn't. And I think that's what's always intrigued me. And I think I started getting interested in all the birds that I would see in my backyard, but I didn't really know what they were. And at some point, I forget what birthday it was, I received a book, a field guide. That really opened my eyes to the world. It's only like I started recognizing familiar characters, but I'm also realizing that there's so many more that I hadn't seen, and I wanted to see them. And European birds are mostly just brown and dull, so it took a while.
We call those sparrows here,
I know.
and that is a pet peeve of many birders saying like, "Oh, it's just a sparrow," because they're like, "What are you talking about? I have field guides dedicated to just sparrows," and I was like, "I need one of those because I struggle." Yeah,
even the warblers are brown.
Oh.
It's not fair. It's not fair.
Yeah.
But there's some really cool ones, and I really started to just see all the different players in the landscape, and it's just fascinating to me. And it never really meant anything to me at the time, but it wasn't until fairly recently, certainly now, that book that I started out with was Roger Tory Peterson's Field Guide to the Birds of Great Britain and Europe.
Oh wow.
So my spark book, my first field guide, that really was sort of the start of my sort of more organized interest in the natural world, started with a Peterson field guide. And I came to the US in 2001, so it's fairly recent still. And I came here through Latin America, Central America. I lived in Central America for about 13 years. The whole concept of a Peterson field guide series wasn't really a thing for me because I was never really raised with that. And full disclosure, I'm a herpetologist. I really like frogs and snakes and turtles. So my real first conscious experience with a Peterson field guide was the Peterson field guide to the reptiles of the eastern US and then western. They were the best of their kind. They were just the most amazing books. They were totally this like pre-packaged just compendium of everything cool in the United States, right?
So the bird guide, you had that at home in the Netherlands,
yeah,
but
so
then you
European.
didn't realize that there there wouldn't have been one in Europe. There's no
That's the
Peterson
only one.
guide.
It's the only Peterson guide that's relevant to Europe. Yeah.
Wow.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which is interesting too, because when you knowing now, fast forward, most people, and I love that you brought up the wildflower guide, because it's one of my favorite Peterson guides, and it's one of the few, of course, that Roger had a major hand in. He didn't obviously do them all. He was the editor-in-chief of the series early on, and really made sure that his original books became sort of a series of books that gave you access to all these different natural elements in the country. But his reach is so much bigger than what people think. He's not just birds, right?
Right.
He's not just
I think that's what people
US
think
birds.
of.
Exactly. Yeah. I think his wildflower guide is really one of his most amazing accomplishments.
Oh yeah, that was
And
my
he's-
first wildfire.
Right,
guide, yeah.
right. And just when you learn the backstory about how much time it took to put that together and the amount of effort it takes, and I know from experience how hard it is to start writing a field guide for a group of organisms in a place where there's absolutely nothing to begin with, where you have to just do everything the hard way, like finding these creatures first and then somehow like illustrating them and putting it all together and wrapping all that information into a book is insane. It's
Daunting.
insane.
Yeah.
I
To say
still
the least.
wonder why I still do it, but
But I'm really glad you brought that up because you had said that you had written 4 field guides. What are those in?
So my first field guide came out in 2001, and it was a guide to the amphibians and reptiles of Costa Rica. I was down there doing graduate research, and I was really frustrated that I couldn't find the resources at all to figure out what I was looking at. I was focused on coral snakes and coral snake mimicry, very, very specific, very focused. But of course, I was living in a rainforest environment, and you're just constantly tripping over these amazing animals, and absolutely no way of knowing what they were. And I literally came down straight from Europe, first time on a plane, going to Costa Rica. I lived in the jungle for 9 months straight.
Wow.
And I had photocopied research papers from like the 1800s in there, because those were the resources I had. That was all there was. And this is
Trying to keep them
internet.
dry in the rainforest.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which I still have them. I have them in Ziploc bags, and every time I open them, they smell like wet potatoes. It's great. We always joke about the Rainforest Breeze shampoos. That's all a lie. Rainforests really smell like wet potatoes.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, but it's, there were no pictures. I scraped all my money together as a poor student to do a few color copies of color photographs of a few species that I could find, so to have those with me as reference. Everything else I had were these 1870s lithographs.
So if you find a frog down there, you don't know what it is. You look through all your photocopied papers. What do you do at that point?
So the only thing I had, which had come out in the mid-1980s, which was the only resource really for the whole country's herpetofauna, was a dichotomous key, a museum key for specimens. So, which was great. So I had a sense of what could be there, should be there, and how I could potentially sort of derive from finding a frog to what it could be. But some of these identification steps required counting teeth on salamanders that are like an inch and a half long, right? So the kind of things that you do with a microscope in a laboratory, not in a jungle where you have this wriggling creature in your hands and you're trying to figure this out.
Right.
And there were steps in there that would look at the color of certain glass frogs in preservative because they turn purplish instead of green. Yeah. So they're really green. Yeah. So you find this green frog, and I'm looking at the key trying to figure out what shade of purple it needs to be to figure, right? So
if you were dead in formaldehyde.
Right.
Yeah,
so,
I learned the same way with fish. We had to use preserved specimens, and it was tough because so many of these fish are so colorful. And then you're just looking at these specimens in jars that have been there for how many years? Yeah. And you're like, I have no idea.
Not so colorful.
Right. And the obvious field marks that you would use for a field guide are not there, exactly, like the colors. And dealing with tropical amphibians, for example, colors are fantastic, but they're useless because some of these species are so variable that just describing one color pattern
is almost useless.
Give you anything to go with.
Yeah. We should say for listeners that don't know, I imagine a lot of our listeners do know, but a dichotomous key. So we've been using the term field guide, and most people would think, you open it up, there's pictures, either drawings or photographs, along with descriptions, range maps, but dichotomous keys are more academic, usually no or limited pictures, right?
Right.
And those are based on characteristics that you can look at, and you make choices. If the plant has 5 leaves, go to this page and look at this group. Yeah. So you continually make choices, and it's a process of elimination until you get down. Hopefully.
Right. And then you have no way of double checking whether you actually took a wrong turn somewhere along the way or not.
Right.
You just have a name, and you just have to go with that. Yeah, so I still have all my notebooks from my original trips, and I literally wrote down every single step in the key so that going back I could always figure out where I could have gone wrong, so that if I ended up later realizing that I was wrong, I could sort of retrace my steps and take a different turn somewhere.
So do you talk to young researchers now in the field and just shake your head and say, you have no idea how hard?
This is where that senior director thing comes in. I feel like an old man. I'm like, when I was doing this stuff
back in my day,
I used to run through the woods with a car battery strapped to my back in the spotlight, right?
Wow. Now they just whip out their phone.
I know, right? Everything is in your pocket, and it's fantastic. I love that technology. I love just the new plant apps. You just point it at a plant and you hit go. And
but in the jungles of Costa Rica, would you be able to still?
No.
Very unlikely.
Yeah. And it's funny because I take students down to the tropics quite a bit still, and the places I tend to work tend to be completely off the grid, and you just see students just go through withdrawal as soon as we lose cell phone coverage. They're just done. They're dysfunctional.
At a loss.
They're a mess.
Yeah.
You see them stumbling out of bed in the morning, and the first thing they do is they walk over to the corner where their backpack is, and they dig for their phone and turn it back on, and then you see their faces just drop, but there's still no bars.
You know what you should do? If they know they're going to go on a trip like that, 6 months beforehand, you should have them switch their service to Sprint, and then
they'll know.
They'll know what it's like to go like somewhere and not have any signal.
Are we going to get screwed?
We have to bleep that out.
Good to know. All right. So you're down in Costa Rica. You're trying to publish your first field guide, right?
Yeah. So I started collecting imagery, and I started sort of gathering information. And the more and more I was doing this, I realized there was a real need for this. There were so many researchers in places like Costa Rica who were undoubtedly facing the same challenges that I had. And I kind of alluded to this earlier. I was never a model student in school, ever. I never did well in traditional learning environments. My brain is just not wired that way. And I honestly started writing a field guide for my own sake, just to keep all this stuff together. So, and I still do this. I write all these books, and I literally, when people ask me questions, more often than not, I just grab my book to look it up, because I can't. There's so much stuff going on all the time. I can't keep it all in my head anymore.
Sure. So after you published that field guide, how did you end up publishing 3 more?
Well, then I ended up doing a big chunk of the wildlife guide of Costa Rica, because I was training naturalist guides. I was actually managing a rainforest preserve, the area that I used to work in, and again, you just gather all this knowledge, and it's just not available in books anywhere. So I just want to do something with it, and I have a research background, I have scientific training, but I never really had time or taken the time to really write a lot of research papers. I've not really been working in the really sort of ivory tower type academic situations where the publisher parish was not so much a challenge for me.
Right.
I just always felt like I had a better ability to communicate to a different audience what I was seeing, what I was experiencing, and I still felt like that was equally important, if not more important, because I'm working with all these other researchers who, just like me originally, were so focused on the one thing they're studying, and they're surrounded by this just amazing diversity, and I don't see it. Just like the same we're seeing around here. People walk the streets and they don't see the kind of things that I see, and I just want to grab people by the scruff of the neck and say, like, oh,
Yeah.
you don't see those plants? You see that? Look, there's an eagle flying over. People don't see it.
But the blindness is amazing, because you're constantly surrounded by it.
Yeah.
I remember when I was first getting into it, all my early hiking days were with my friend Matt, who runs another podcast that a lot of people may know. But, he's been kind of doing this outdoorsy stuff, and he's been really into nature his whole life, or at least a really big chunk of his life. And we'd be walking down a path, and he'd be like, oh my God, look at this caterpillar, even if he didn't know what it was.
Yeah.
He would find all these little things, like whether it was an insect or a tiny plant that everyone else missed, but it was in flower, it was blooming. And I kind of grew up with that, where at almost a certain point, I was like, how is he seeing all this stuff, but I can't see it? But it's because just from the experience and being exposed to it, his brain was wired a little bit differently than mine at the time. Like, eventually I got to the point where now I go hiking with people and I'm pointing out all these things, and they're like, Steve, why are you seeing all this stuff?
You're that guy.
Like, how are you finding it? Yeah, and I've kind of become...
You don't see it until you start looking.
Yeah.
Like
until you know what to look,
Like you with your field guide, your bird.
Yeah.
But,
it's seeing and it's hearing and it's just experiencing in other ways. I walk through the woods and I can hear things kind of scurrying away, and I can tell whether it's a snake or a lizard just from how it moves.
Right.
So can you give the listeners an idea of how you ended up from being in Costa Rica, down in Central America? How did you end up going from there to here, and then what do you do here?
So originally I was doing a lot of work for European universities. I was working at the University of Frankfurt in Germany, running expeditions, really doing biodiversity research in Central America, all over Central America. A lot of work was taking place in areas that were coming out of conflicts, where the focus had shifted from conservation to survival in most cases, economic recovery. And you get to these situations where, farmers suddenly have the ability to go back into their original lands again, and there used to be forests and now there's not, or farming had stopped for a long time and suddenly they needed to rebuild their businesses and their livelihoods, and they went back to business as usual. And in a lot of cases, for several years, because of political histories in those areas, a lot of forests just disappeared for a variety of reasons, and nobody even knew about it because nobody was focused on it, because there was obviously other emphasis there. So going back and resurveying some of these areas, I remember going to Nicaragua first with a small expedition, trying to find out how the Atlantic rainforest looked, because it was at that point still thought to be the largest intact stretch of lowland rainforest in Central America. And spending weeks just trying to find any, not even finding forest, let alone anything pristine.
Wow.
For the first time really having boots on the ground, and kind of regrouping after that and trying to figure out where should priorities be. Often working with governments, you go to a government office and you meet with the Minister of Environment, and they're sitting behind a desk and there's a big map on the wall with all these beautiful polygons on there, these outlines of where the national parks are. And then you go into these areas and most of them just have some cows in it and no trees, and these people have no resources to actually go check those preserves to actually see if they're still there.
They're paper parks.
Yeah, they're paper parks, exactly. So
like paper towns. I've never heard of paper parks before.
Yeah.
Well, paper towns are different.
Paper parks are a thing, though.
Really?
Yeah, they are.
Wow.
Yeah.
So they're parks on paper only.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
and it's there. It's often people protect these, sometimes with the best intentions, without really having the resources to even know what's going on, or having the expertise to know how to deal with that, or even to deal with, even if the parks were still there, to know how to properly manage them and to know where some of the last strongholds for some of their really critical biodiversity would be. So I did that for quite a long time and lived in Central America, kind of bopping around from there. Originally mostly for European-based entities, and eventually gradually more with U.S.-based entities.
I picture you as like a Indiana Jones, like fedora.
It's mostly like really dirty and smelling like wet potatoes.
Yeah.
I love that it's wet potatoes and not just potatoes.
It's different. You got to try it sometime.
All right, so.
Yeah, but eventually I realized that I was really kind of cut off from the rest of the world, living in the middle of nowhere, literally, and loving every aspect of it. But it's hard to have a life out there too. So.
Yeah.
So gradually...
Can't watch Friends out there.
No.
Sorry, you can't rewatch Friends.
That's right.
So I eventually came here and landed in Connecticut with some friends and ended up teaching in a high school, actually in a school that I had made a connection with before, because I used to teach their students in the rainforest. I would get a tractor load of students dumped on my doorstep every year, and I would work with them. And
they must have loved you and stories.
I hope so. Yeah. I never lost one, so far so good.
No, but I mean, just teaching in Connecticut, your incredible background. I imagine most other teachers probably didn't like you very much, because they were like, well, I came from grad school.
Right.
You come swinging in on a vine from the jungle.
Right.
Yeah, and actually before that too, I did a lot of, part of my research also focused on tree canopy species. So I actually started working with a researcher, actually from New York State, Donald Perry. He's from the Rochester area originally. He was like the Jacques Cousteau of the rainforest canopy, and that's actually kind of what got me in the area. Like I always, ever since I was a kid, as long as I can remember, even before I could probably read, I would go to the library and pick out, the Disney, the Time Life rainforest books with the amazing pictures, and I would live vicariously through these books, and that's still how I think I still enjoy the field guide so much. I just travel through these books. I'm making mental wish lists of things I want to see if I ever get there, you know, that kind of stuff. That was really the impetus, like realizing that there's this guy out there who had unlocked the rainforest canopy, and having done all my research and knowing there was really hardly any information, but nothing about things that lived 100 feet over our heads that were sometimes completely confined there, species that would never really come down. The only thing we knew about them was from these old historic descriptions of researchers in the early 1900s following these logging crews, just waiting for the canopy to come to them and then pick out these mangled bodies and just describing those, right?
It's like the shotgun ornithology of dendrology.
This is what was here.
And we think it kind of looked like this, but you can't really tell anymore because it just came crashing down with a giant tree behind it. So I did a lot of tree climbing work, and for many years I was a technical assistant for the BBC. I would help camera crews rig all kinds of documentaries.
All right,
that, by the way, that's so, I had no idea that you did that. One of my favorite books of all time, and I highly recommend all of our listeners read it. It's called The Wild Trees. Have you read that? Either of you guys?
No, I don't.
Oh, it's such an incredible book. It just follows researchers that study essentially the ecosystems up in the redwoods out west. And I mean, it's a very I don't want to say it's very sciencey. It's definitely sciencey, but it's much more about the interpersonal relationships of the researchers and what, especially what the main character was going through. But I just thought it was a fascinating book. It made me want to climb trees myself. In fact, I think I do have a friend that did end up going out west, and then she started doing a lot of tree climbing and stuff like that. So I think professionally, she had all the gear and everything else. So, but it's such an amazing. I don't know. At least reading about it, I spent a lot of my childhood climbing trees. Like I said earlier, my family owns a lot of land. We built tree forts, but most of the time we'd just be climbing up in trees. And if a tree came down in the forest, that was even more exciting, because you could still get 20, 30 feet in the air, but it would just be on a tree that's kind of tipped over, and that was super exciting too. But so I kind of lived my childhood up in trees and stuff, but nothing as intense as having the gear going up, 100 plus feet. Yeah, that sounds amazing to me.
It is absolutely amazing. And it's I've never been, but I imagine it being like the Galapagos, where animals are not used to seeing people, and you can walk right up to a hawk sitting on a pole somewhere.
Wow.
It's been I've had so many experiences where animals would just come check me out as I was up there, and they'd be just as close as we are right now. Troops of monkeys and parrots would just sit right there, not even they're wondering what this weird creature is up here and what it's doing. And
now I have to ask, have you ever seen the movie Arachnophobia?
Oh, of course.
All right, so have you ever seen it?
No.
So this is from 90s, 80s, maybe? So in that movie, they're researching in the rainforest and they set up all these traps on the forest floor, and then they like send some kind of chemical up.
Yep.
Does that actually happen?
Yeah, so that's actually based on one of the most famous tropical entomologists. Terry Irwin is his name. He's a famous, I think he passed away fairly recently. That's what he used to do. He's the guy who he would fog these trees, individual trees, and would look at the diversity of mostly Coleoptera beetles out there. And then he would do it with different trees, and he would realize that every single species of tree had its own unique fauna.
Wow.
And he's the guy who sort of extrapolated like how many different insect species there might actually still be out there based on the number of
that we have
trees.
no
and
idea.
This is like order of magnitude. Like he literally extended our awareness by like an order of magnitude.
Aren't Coleoptera one of the biggest or most diverse groups?
They are.
Yeah.
They
They
are.
are. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, there's so many and we see the same thing here, of course. There's so many species tied to specific trees, but
Right.
Wow.
the tree diversity in the tropics is
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
yeah. So for tree climbing too, like you start to realize which trees are climbable and which ones aren't. So once you figure out what kind of trees are safer to climb, trying to find another one of the same species is absolutely madness. It just doesn't
Right.
work.
It's
Yeah.
not like here.
And a lot of trees have, as a total aside here, have all these different defenses because I don't want to get too sidetracked here, but
It's okay.
No, we love the sidetracks. I feel like this is going to be
we
like.
might split this into 2 episodes.
I was actually thinking about bringing that up. Yeah.
So in a tropical rainforest, unlike a temperate rainforest or temperate forest, the bulk of the biodiversity is maintained in living organisms. It's all above ground. Now, there's hardly anything in the ground. So tropical soils are this like tennis court red clay, right? Your lateritic soil has nothing in it, nothing grows in it. There's not a layer of soil on top of it like we see here. There's a layer of soil on top of it like we see here, but there it's like 2 inches thick. And these like 200-foot trees grow in sometimes less than a foot of soil. And
Wow.
all of the biomass is contained above ground pretty much. So the little bit that's on the soil is completely contained in these mycelia, these hyphens from all these fungi to take it all together, right? And that's what the trees tap into again. But most of the biomass is above ground and mostly in the canopy. So it's this huge competition for light to get to grow, right? So that's why you have epiphytes and hemiepiphytes. You have plants that grow on plants. You have plants that are true epiphytes that don't have roots in the soil, that grow anywhere as long as they have access to water and sunlight. So mostly they're in the treetops. And hemiepiphytes do that, but then also send down roots into the soil and can sort of have a giant straw to suck some additional resources out. So long story short, trees are all like top heavy because they're completely covered in other plants that don't have the infrastructure to grow towards the light. They just sit on top of somebody else. And that's not a good thing because trees become top heavy. They have hardly any root system because there's no soil there. So they flip over really easily. They fall over really easily. So trees have all these different mechanisms to avoid having too much weight and too much biomass growing on them. So some have chemical defenses, some amazing stuff. There's a whole family of trees that exudes essential amino acids through its bark. So essential amino acids are the kind of amino acids that you have to get from your food. Your body can't produce it itself. So all these animals are desperate for sources of these essential amino acids. So they munch on the bark and in the process like knock off epiphytes and stuff like that.
Wow.
And some trees, so this is where I was kind of getting to, some trees have fracture planes in their branches. So when the tops get too heavy, they can very easily, relatively painlessly shed an entire branch, which would be the size of one of our trees here, rather than like losing the entire crown or falling over. So those are the trees that you need to figure out. So unfortunately, no one had written the field guide to like the trees of Costa Rica yet. So you're always testing these kind of things where there were literally trees. I had a friend who was studying the pollinators of these Fuchsia trees, and the local name is botarama, Spanish for branch droppers, and that's exactly what they do.
Wow. Now that's a good common name. I have some issues with common names from time to time. But that's a good one. Yeah.
So we would actually, at first we started to climb these trees, and we like climb up and we bring these like aluminum extendable ladders, and we like lash those to the trunk as high as we can climb, and then we like extend them over.
How high up were you?
140, 150
Oh my
feet.
God. Holy
cow,
Yeah.
wow.
And he was nuts. He actually you try to get above the crown, so you have to go higher than the highest branches. So that's where the ladders came in. So we're like balancing on these like ladders on top of these giant trees. But then the pollinators, of course, are like all go away from you. So they're like a few feet away from you. So we're trying to catch them. He was actually photographing them. He was carrying one of these like giant rocket launcher 600 millimeter, like $20,000 lenses on his back as he was doing this kind of stuff. But But then we realized that the trees, these botaраmas, drop their branches really easily. So rather than actually climbing up there when we needed to collect flowers, we'd actually just shoot a little line up into the branch, but farther away from the trunk. And
pull?
Yeah, just pull and run for
Wow.
your dear life.
That's
and
amazing.
These huge branches would just come crashing down, and then we just go back and collect the flowers. But yeah, it's just fascinating stuff. But there's just so much out there we don't know.
See, this is what I'm talking about. You're teaching kids in high school, and these are the stories you have.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The teacher next door is not going to have a story like that.
When I was in school.
Right. All right, so you're in Connecticut telling these awesome stories.
Yeah, so I did that for a year, and then I, of course, was having some serious withdrawal from herpetology, so I found the local herpetologists and hooked up with the folks at Yale University's Peabody Museum of Natural History at the herpetology division there. And I started working there as a researcher, so I started continuing the work I'd been doing for quite some time already, but based out of Yale University, out of the Peabody Museum.
Wow.
Doing a lot of museum work.
He says
there
it so
too.
nonchalant.
But what a CV, though.
It's a Peabody Museum, you know.
Yeah.
It's awesome. They have dinosaurs and everything. It's awesome. Yeah, but I did that for a while, but then you're living off grant money. I was a foreigner. I'm still not a citizen. I'm a permanent resident here. So there's all kinds of other constraints to what I could and could not do. And I struggled with kind of what I alluded to earlier, like suddenly being stuck in this research box again and not really reaching the kind of audience that I wanted to reach, that I thought I could really do more with too. So I've all my life I've been sort of struggling between, I hate to call it research, it's more like satisfying my personal curiosity, I think, more than anything. But having at least the training to follow through and really being able to identify problems and trying to find answers for those. But then sharing that knowledge with as many people as possible, right? So it's this whole kind of research and education kind of thing.
I think the best naturalists, they're always in conflict about what they want to do more, teach or learn.
Right, exactly, yeah. So then you do one. So I did one. I was doing research, and I was like, I really want to teach. And then I took a teaching job at a university in Connecticut, thinking I would have these nice long summer breaks so I can just go travel to the tropics and keep doing my research. And before I knew it, I had a 200% teaching load and not a single minute to even do anything but grade lab papers. And so I went from one extreme to the other, and then a position opened up at the Connecticut Audubon Society, where they were looking for someone to restart their conservation division. And I thought, that's with the connections I'd made, with the academic connections I had, with the sort of educational connections I had, I thought, let's try that. And of course, it was an Audubon Society, so I had to learn birds really quickly. I knew my European birds and my tropical birds, but I somehow ended up on another part of the country, or the world actually, where I wasn't really terribly familiar. So
what's a chickadee?
I know. I had this horrible long commute, so I would listen to the Peterson field guides on CDs, right, and listen to all the bird calls. So I memorized all those. So I got pretty good with that. But
a little less diversity in Connecticut than in Costa Rica.
Yeah, but a lot of the birds move back and forth, so it's nice
true.
to see familiar faces.
Right.
So I band birds. I'm a bird bander too, and I do that here as well as in the tropics, and it's just amazing to see birds that I love going in the spring and banding migrants. You check their fat scores. You look at how much they're actually bulking up to get ready for the trip, and sometimes you catch these chestnut-sided warblers and they look like flying meatballs. They're ready to go. And then I hop on the plane and I get back all exhausted, and 2 weeks later you see the first chestnut-sided warbler show up in your backyard, and you're like, these guys just did it on their own accord, right? They didn't hop on a plane. They're like, I was tired, but I can't even imagine what it's like for those creatures. Yeah, but it's just those connections are just so fascinating, so fascinating. And I think the educational value of connecting parts of the world too, because of that. You can work in totally different parts of the world, and we're all dealing with the same problems. We're all dealing with the same challenges, and we're all dealing with the same constraints that people just don't see what needs to be seen, so that we can start raising the awareness that we all need to get, so that people are better stewards of our planet, or their own backyards even, and to let people realize that their own backyards are connected to somebody else's backyard. And it's not just your neighbor's backyard, but it could be a backyard in Costa Rica or Panama or somewhere else, right? And I think those kind of connections are so critically important, and are so missing from the public's awareness right now. I don't think people really realize that we don't live in a bubble, that we don't live in a vacuum, that
a lot of people feel that they do.
Yeah, but I'm not sure if it's even conscious. I think society kind of created that situation.
Yes.
I always joke about this, and I don't want to offend anybody, but I have kids in school. One is just about to start high school, one's in middle school. they love this stuff. They love being outside. They love just creepy crawlies. My son is like, he wants to be an entomologist mostly because it's great to bring spiders into the house, and my wife and his sister love it, and he's at that age too, but he just genuinely loves this stuff. He's genuinely interested in this stuff, and it's just because I made him early on, and I didn't even really try to. Like, kids, I think, innately just enjoy all this kind of stuff, and they lose it. But I see them go to school, and the first week of school, not this year, but in a normaler year, the first week of school, they learn about all the exciting stuff that's going to happen in the year. And there's always that, the elusive field trips at the end of the year when all the learning is done, and maybe there's some time left and there's some money left in the school budget. And we'll load everybody up into a giant yellow can, and we'll drive for however long, and we'll open the doors, and there's going to be nature, and you get to run around in it, and eat lunch in it, and then you go back in your can and you go back home. And it's that disconnect that we start so early on, not realizing that you walk through nature to get to the yellow can, or just to go to school every day. It's just really devastating.
Yeah. And
people who work their entire career so they can retire early, so they can go travel and see the world. Stupid. The world's there the whole time, and it's these backyards are all connected. So we're just walking by this stuff all the time, like some of us aiming to someday enjoy it, but we're missing out. We're really missing out. Yeah.
All right, we sidetracked you from talking about applying for the job for Audubon.
All right, so I applied and I got the job. And
long story short.
So I worked in Connecticut for 7 years doing that and really rebuilding conservation efforts. And it's one of these cyclical things where these organizations do the same kind of thing we were just describing, to kind of shift their focuses from what's really needed, what society wants, what's possible, what's feasible. And in the course of things, the real focus on boots on the ground conservation had kind of gone missing. They had a whole network of nature centers and educators, but had lost all their conservation stuff. The same kind of thing happened when I was, and just before I was at Yale too. Like there are these sort of cyclical societal things where all the organismal folks at Yale had been laid off or disappeared. There was like nobody there teaching courses about plants and animals.
Right.
They were the smartest people on the planet, shaking test tubes and doing all this like amazing genetic work and molecular work and all kinds of other work. But most of them, I would hook up with researchers who were studying some sort of organism that I was familiar with, and I would go talk to them. And more often than not, they wouldn't even be able to recognize one of these things if they stumbled over it in the woods, right? Because they just dealt with a bunch of
micro and macro.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Well, even at the college that I went to before the one I'm at now, I was talking with the head of the biology department, and I was like, how come there's not like any plant stuff here? Why is there one class? Why is there just a 400 level class called plant physiology, and then there's like nothing else? And he's like, well, actually, there used to be a ton of us. Like there was a ton of botanists in the department. He's like, in fact, my previous work was all plant-based, and now he works with worms. He does genetic stuff. But he was like, yeah, just over time, just slowly, one by one, all the botanists in the department dropped off, and we replaced them with microbiology people or ecology, but nothing like ornithology, mammalogy, botany, stuff like that. It's not. Is it not like a selling point or something? Like what is the? I don't know why it drops off.
I remember you started really broadly. The whole education system is different there anyway. But I remember my first year studying biology, and in Europe, like if you go and study biology, that's all you take. No pottery classes or nothing like that. Like nothing but biology. And at the very end of the first year, all of us were told, well, we knew we had to do it early on, but there were 2 1-week courses. One was on animal diversity, one was plant diversity.
2 weeks.
Yeah, 2 weeks. And it was really intense, but we were already told at the time, most of you will go into some other field that you'll never need this kind of knowledge. But, when you come out of this thing and you have a biology degree, people are going to come to you and say, hey, what's this plant? And you're probably like a vet or whatever, right? I have no clue. So already we were told, like, as if this was kind of an afterthought, you're going to be called a biologist at some point, so you need to know a little bit about plants and animals so that you can answer the general public's questions kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, and I thought that was just so weird, because those were like the coolest 2 weeks of the entire education pretty much, right? You're just out there nerding out with people, and just the last surviving experts that were still on the faculty that were just... They're just giving it their all for that 1 week, because that was their chance to maybe convert a few of us to like stay in this kind of field. And most of us didn't. But
it's funny, even at the University of Buffalo, where I'm going now, one of our friends graduated from there with an ecology degree, but in the ecology program, there is not a field ecology class. if you want to take field ecology, you have to go into the environmental studies department. And he never ended up taking it. But a lot of his friends, like myself and a bunch of other people we know, did end up taking that class. And it was one of the most eye-opening classes that I've ever had. Like, I think the very first day, he took us right outside the building, and we walked 20 feet from the building, and that's where we did all of our identification. We weren't really allowed to use the word lawn because the lawn is made up of so many species that, we were identifying all these non-natives that, that were just covering the place that normally you just walk past and you wouldn't even think twice about. But that was like a lot of our first exposure to things like that. And then eventually we did kind of get to the edge, some edge habitat for a little forest we have over there. And we started identifying other things like bone set and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But but it was just amazing. He forced us to start on a lawn, and just something that everyone sees all the time. All of these things are in our backyards and on the side of our sidewalks.
I know, it's like here too, like often I ask random people in the city when we're going for a walk, like, how many birds do you think are in the city here? Like, how many different birds do you think are here, right? Because, I'm just nerdy like that. I keep track of, I live in the city, I just keep track of the birds that I've seen in my backyard. And, if they all sort of like huddle together, they can probably come up with maybe 20 or so, right? And I'm like, I know I've got over 140 birds on my yard list, so I'm like, I got 140.
Yeah.
So, but just to show people, like, if you know what to look, it's like I always call it my superpower. It's like these things where you're like, you go to like a barbecue and people realize you're like into biology, and people are like, you know what? When I was younger, I used to see these like tanagers. They're like, I haven't seen one in probably like 50 years. And I'm sitting there going like, I can hear one right now, right over there, right?
Right.
So now you whip out your superpower and you're like, guess what?
It's funny when we do the birdathon every year. I ask people, I'm like, oh, how many birds do you think we got? And at first they're like, 200. And I was like, I mean like bird species, which 200 is even pretty low anyway. But they're like, species, I don't know, like 20 or whatever. Right. And we're like, no, we got, what was this year, 140 something. 140 or something. And that was in 24 hours.
Right,
and a big chunk of that we were sleeping. So
But we should say Tom Kerr did most of it.
Well, we go with someone that's like a level 20 birder, and
he's our ringer.
Yeah. Whereas I should say it's not like we're dopes when it comes to birds or anything. No. It's just that Tom is so dope that
But there's an interesting, cool, I think Roger Tory Peterson anecdote. So Roger was born and raised here in Jamestown, right? So, and I think that's sort of like one of the reasons why I wanted to come here, because I just thought this is so cool that this all, like, for me personally, his work, before even knowing about Roger Tory Peterson, like, his work really sparked my interest in nature, and there have been all these different touch points. There's a variety of reasons why I ended up here, but I think the concept that this is sort of in any kind of town, anywhere, there's nothing really special about Jamestown, New York. There's so many towns like this. Everybody laments the fact that this used to be such a great place with all these factories booming and all this stuff is being produced here, and all the jobs are gone, and the young people don't want to stay here and they go somewhere else, and they all go to bigger cities. And I get that, and these are all real observations and real concerns. But I'm coming out here, and I used to come out here. My wife's family lives close by, so that was sort of my introduction to this area that kind of got me to this area on the radar. And I befriended the previous president of the Roger Tory Peterson Institute. When I come on family visits, I would come out for Christmas and sneak off and go birding with him, and we'd just nerd out together. So I knew about the place long before I started working here, and I was just blown away by everything out here. Just having one county the size of Rhode Island with nobody in it, and every time I showed up, I'm finding stuff that nobody had even seen. I'm hanging out with one of the best naturalists in the area, and I'm like, how about pine warblers? If I was in this exact same place and it was in Connecticut, there'd be pine warblers in a tree, and he would say, oh no, we don't really get pine warblers. I'm like, can I just play a call? And he's like, sure. And then I would play a call, and pine warbler sings back, and it's like kid in the candy store kind of stuff. I'm like, this is amazing, And then just that amazing recent geological history, and just the watersheds, and we're on the top of two of the biggest watersheds in the country, so we have these Class A, really high quality feeder streams, and I still I don't get to play outside nearly as much as I want to, but every time I do, I find stuff that's not supposed to be here. It's awesome. It's just.
So is that how you ended up getting the job here? Is because you had contacts?
Yeah. So Jim Barry, our previous president before me, he retired and put my name in the hat. I was intrigued by the possibilities here, and the kind of projects that I was doing in Connecticut, where I was connecting real life researchers with students who might have an interest in those fields and putting them together on projects, which realistically made it more affordable to do these projects because you have interns and students that work for credit instead of environmental consultants that are unaffordable. So you can actually do the work that needed to be done when nobody could afford to do it. But you also got these young people excited and really just entrenched in like real research at a point in their career where they would never be able to do these kind of things, or like we were talking about earlier, where they wouldn't be exposed to the kind of classes or professors or experiences that they may have wanted going into these kind of careers, but they're not even offered anymore. You don't even have the people teaching you biology, old school, flora and fauna, plants and animals. So there's so many different career options out there, and there's so many ways students can prepare for so many different fields, but biology is just so broad. And there's like, if you're into really natural history type research, ecological research, it's so difficult before you get to college to really get exposure. There really aren't any sort of after school clubs or entities that offer these kind of experiences. If you're into sports, school doesn't give you enough, you join a club, right? If you're into music, same kind of thing. But if you're really into nature, where do you go? Where do you go before you get a chance? I did the same thing. Like I said, I wasn't very good in school, and I was going through high school thinking like, oh, this sucks, I need to get out of here. And I was the first kid in my family to ever go to college, so I couldn't waste that opportunity because it would have devastated my parents. But at the same time, I was thinking like, I'm not sure what I'm doing with my life. Biology seemed like the closest fit to something that I would really enjoy, but I didn't really know what I'd sign on for.
Yeah.
But I run into kids all the time in the community like that. They're just, you get them out on a field trip or an experience or an internship or like our summer programs that we do, and you can just see these kids are so into this, and this is the first time somebody like grabs them and throws them out of the comfort zone and like puts them in waders and throws them in the river and has them catch turtles and like hold birds and pull invasives, and you can just see that this is something that they would like to do more with, but there's no opportunity unless you create it. So I really saw this as an opportunity to kind of be that conduit for that. Roger was really, in my mind, about using his own personal talents to go back to Jamestown. It's any town, and Roger really was just any kid. He didn't have superpowers. He was an incredible artist. He had an incredible eye, just like we've been talking about for the last hour or so. It's like, I think everybody has it. Everybody can develop it. Most people don't, and the only way you can develop it is if you have somebody who kind of helps you nudge that along. And he had that in like an elementary school teacher who had sort of a nature club on the side, and he credits Miss Hornback with that a lot during his career, to joining his Audubon club and getting in there. But ultimately it was his own doing and his own interest and his own drive to just learn and learn and learn, just be the sponge and just soak up this information, and then use whatever talent he had an awful lot of them, of course, to like take that information that he had in his head and convey it in a way that it would spark the same kind of sentiment in other people, to convey that to other people. And he didn't do it in sort of a traditional fashion. He wasn't a researcher. He had no research background at all, but he was incredibly talented at condensing so much information into a little visual.
Yeah.
Right? A little cartoon bird with an arrow. There you have it.
We talk about science communication. He was a good
it's
visual
so
science
important.
communicator.
Yeah.
Now, I'm looking at our time. Can you give the listeners an idea of at least like one of the projects you're working on now? Because I know when we had met, you had talked a little bit about terrapins. I don't know if that was part of the Institute or not.
Yeah. So I still have a lot of projects ongoing that are sort of separate from the Peterson Institute. I can't let them go anymore. I've done a lot of work with critically endangered amphibian populations, and I'm now fortunate enough to like be able to work with frogs that were gone and they're coming back. So we're still do some real research
down
with
in
some
Central
students.
America.
Yeah.
Okay.
But here, the sort of, for logistical reasons, I'm most of the year I'm here in Jamestown. So knowing that we're walking on the same grounds that inspired Roger Tory Peterson when he was a kid, blank slate, no real background, and kind of the same stuff we talked about earlier when I first went to Costa Rica. You just wow by all this stuff, but you don't really know what it is, and you just kind of educate yourself. He did exactly the same thing on the streets of Jamestown, and I want other people to have that experience, kids, but anybody really at this point. So like I said before, like more every time I go out here I find stuff that's not supposed to be here, or something that people kind of knew was here but didn't realize that it was something important. So one of the first things I saw here when I came I was with some folks, actually colleagues from the Peterson Institute, and they're like, oh, you like turtles and reptiles, right? So we got to show you a spot where there's lots of turtles. I'm like, oh, I'm game. So we went over there, and they took me to this industrial parking lot, and there were a bunch of turtles there, but they were all spiny softshell turtles, which is a special concern species in New York State. We're right on the edge of their geographic distribution range right here. They go a little bit farther north. You have a few spots actually going up into Buffalo as well. Yeah, yeah.
Wow, I didn't even know that.
Yeah. They're amazing. So they're these evil Muppets, right? So they're like 1.5 feet across with large females. They make snapping turtles look like teddy bears in terms of disposition.
Oh.
They have these floppy shells, and they're built for speed. They're super fast swimmers. And they're really a southern species, and they're really common in places where you find them, but they're not common in places where they're not supposed to be like here, except for this one industrial parking lot in the middle of Jamestown, which after I started really looking around more and really starting to study them, turned out to be this hotbed for softshell turtles. It's like the biggest breeding site for softshell turtles in New York State.
And no one knew about it.
Nobody knew about it.
So when did you come upon this?
My first year in 2012 here.
Wow, so just 8 years ago.
Yeah, to the point that every year I have to apply for permits from the Department of Environmental Conservation to be allowed to be near these turtles because they're endangered.
Right.
But I'm always hesitant to report how many I see because it's a numbers game, and they will actually be removed from the endangered species list if people actually knew how many we had here.
Right.
But it's really localized. So it's what I'm getting to really is that, like, even though I'm still working in these really remote parts of the planet, I've worked all over and dealing with really pristine places, as pristine as possible. I am absolutely fascinated with urban nature because this parking lot is literally the worst scenario you could have imagined for a species like this, and it works. So
they're doing okay.
They're doing great.
The population's not declining.
We had 120 some nests the first season.
Whoa. Holy cow!
And most of them failed because it's a horrible site.
Right.
But at the same time, the habitat doesn't sustain more than what's there already, probably.
But generally, don't most turtle species have a pretty low success rate?
It's a pretty low success rate, so that's okay.
That's why they live for so long.
Yeah, exactly. But that's the other cool thing. So, when I first started talking about these discoveries and what I'm seeing here to people in the community and the people at city councils and stuff, I would start talking about having students out there, and we're counting nests, and we're like doing these giant seine nets to the river so we can try to catch and tag these turtles. And people would stop me in mid-conversation and go, "You put our kids in the river?" Because they thought it was an industrial wasteland and they would either dissolve or catch on fire by touching the water. And I love that part, because when you look at the river, it looks like it can catch on fire anytime. It looks like, it's these industrial remnants of this historical Jamestown,
right,
where 70, 80 years ago, you couldn't even see that river because it was underneath factories.
Wow.
And the river was trapdoors in the floor of the workspace, right? And at the end of the day, the trapdoor opened up and everything that needed to go, it just got swept into the hole, and the river would carry it away. You like sweep it down the hole, you do it like a hokey pokey, and you look down and it's gone, right? It's this like self-cleaning mess. It's fantastic. So for the longest time, people have been using this river and any river in any town like this for the same way. Like the whole mindset, the mindset has shifted now. So factories are gone, everybody's like, oh, I wish we could have those days back, and I'm thinking like, no, I'm okay with this. It's like, I'd like to have more jobs, but the way we treated our environment historically, we know more now, we can do better than that.
Right.
So to see sensitive species like that, softshell turtles use their soft shell they're kind of like half amphibians. They can actually absorb oxygen, and like they can exchange gases and fluids through their skin.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, so for a large turtle,
they shouldn't be in polluted waters, I would imagine.
Exactly, not polluted waters, and highly oxygenated, so it needs to be cold and it needs to be oxygenated. So whether you like these turtles or not, the fact that we have them without ever taking out a water test kit, I can tell you that that's good water right there.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm finding other stuff in the river that indicates that too. You look at the infrastructure and you go, I want to touch that stuff, great, but it's just these biological indicators are just fantastic tools to communicate what's actually going on. So I'm starting to see people are starting to adopt these turtles as like the community mascots. Like the river is like equated with the turtles.
Yeah.
And they're so weird that they're kind of likable. They're like creepy and weird, or kind of cool and weird, but they're interesting enough that people catch on to this stuff.
Yeah.
So, but the cool thing is, I'm finding all these species that live in these urban environments in completely man-made habitats. And others, like purple martins. Like there's not a single purple martin on the East Coast that lives in a natural habitat. Right. They all live in plastic or cord, right? So
right.
and they're endangered. Their numbers are plummeting. So this is the best kind of conservation. Like I remember like trucking through Nicaragua and working in El Salvador trying to find freaking national parks that were supposed to be there, and you can't fix that. You cannot fix these problems. As much as you want to help polar bears, there's not any amount of money you can send to any organization that is going to help polar bears in the short term. Hopefully we have enough time and something will happen and it turns itself around, but it is beyond a repair. But these kind of things, like species that live in these man-made habitats, if we can figure out how to build it, we can make this stuff. Like the more purple martin gores you put up in the right places, the more purple martins we're going to have. That's the bottleneck right now. You just need to know enough about where to put them, and we can turn the tide on aerial insectivores declining because they live in these kind of habitats. House sparrows in Holland are on the endangered species list or on the watch list because they used to live on the roof tiles and nobody liked that, so they started making these new roof tiles and all these different barriers, and now they blanket in a decade removed wholesale all of their breeding habitat.
Wow.
It's so funny to think of house sparrows as endangered
species.
Right.
But it shows you the impact we've had on the environment. But I think that our ingenuity could be flipped around.
Oh yeah.
If we had the right focus.
Yeah.
How cool would it be to build urban wildlife habitat and really make like cooler, more sustainable urban environments?
And I think you were maybe touching on this point, purposefully or not, but the fact that you don't have to go to one of the most remote places in the world to encounter wildlife that's exceptional.
Yeah. And just on the surface, Jamestown doesn't look any different from so many other places I've been in. There might
like
be
Western
other highlights. It's the same everywhere. There's thousands of cities like that, and you see large metropolitan areas developing these amazing green spaces and green corridors, right? But nobody's figured out how to like scale something like that down so you can create something attractive that still allows for wildlife to function, so people can actually see it.
Where ecology
and
is
come
part
out
of
there, right? And it's not so engineered that it's just lawn and blacktop, so you have a place to ride your bike and run, right?
Right. But
something that's real. That's just part of what was already here before somebody plunked a city on top of it. We still have this stuff here, and maybe that's unique. I don't think maybe not everybody's that fortunate, but we have it, and I cannot stand by and watch it disappear. And knowing that kind of stuff, maybe not so much to river muppet turtles, but like the same kind of birds that were out here that we're still seeing, sparked Roger Tory Peterson, who then used his skills to educate tens of millions of people and got them outside with their field guides and do the same thing in their own backyards. It's huge.
And I think that is a perfect place to stop, because honestly, Twan, I think we could talk to you all day.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But I wanted to end with just a couple sentences that I found from one paper. It really wasn't a study about field guides, but it was from this great journal called The Ecological Citizen.
Yeah, I've heard about that.
So if you're not real familiar with it, I suggest you checking it out, because a lot of the ideas you're talking about, right up your alley, it's talking about looking at society, how they approach nature, trying to envision solutions. But they published an article, two of their editors, called Field Guides as a Gateway to Appreciating More Than Human Concerns. And this is a short passage that I thought would be a perfect place to end. Out of objects, a field guide has forged subjects that are imbued with meaning and value and that have independent concerns. Through this shift, our own worlds have changed. New relationships and value centers have become evident everywhere. And the realization has followed that we too are part of the immense and integrated new whole.
Love it.
Yeah.
Spot on.
Yeah.
All right, so Twan, I think we're going to have you on again sometime in the future.
Yeah.
All right, but thank you so much for spending so much time with us and sharing so much of your knowledge and your incredible stories. And you have made the decision for us. This is going to have to be a 2-part episode. Because
Sorry.
No. It'll be great.
I think story time on the podcast it's a necessity because it gets people more invested, I think.
So thank you.
Oh, thank you for getting me out of my office. I'm glad we can do it outside. It's much better. Really appreciate the time and happy to come back anytime.
Awesome. Great. Okay, folks, thanks for listening. First and foremost, we want to thank our growing list of Patreon supporters. Our new patrons over the past month included Lauren Smith, Jane Harrison, Judy Fennerty, and Kay. Thank you for becoming new patrons.
And while we do appreciate every patron, we do like to give a special shout out to our top patrons. So thank you very much, the Hebranks, Alyssa, Sean, Rich, Jessica, Rachel, Orange Julian, Daniel, Diane, Ken, Lauren, Jane, Rachel and Leah, Indigo, Doodle Dude, Elizabeth, Renz, J. Jean, Callie, Bob, Kazzies, Jeff, Goose, Bruce, Esther, John, Pollywog. We named the dog Indy, and Rob. Thank you guys so much.
We also want to give a very special shout out to listener James Tobalski, who made a $50 donation through PayPal.
Yes, thank you so much.
So if you'd like to become a monthly supporter of the podcast, head on over to Patreon. You can also make a one-time donation through the PayPal button on our website.
But if you can't afford to financially support the podcast, we greatly appreciate when you guys leave reviews for us on iTunes or any other podcatcher. So we do want to thank our new reviewers. So thank you, Betsy2727, Twiggy Titan, and Yit for Shimfa.
Yeah, something like that. We also promised that we would look at our iTunes from other countries. So I did take a quick minute and check out our iTunes Australia reviews. So I want to thank Little Liss Hobo, Joe Johns, Marion987, and DWH22. And it was actually cool to read that Lil Liss Hobo. She said that on our episode she listened to, we mentioned the Allegheny Nature Pilgrimage.
Yeah.
And that they were going virtual this year.
Mm-hmm.
So she actually attended some of the virtual programs. So
wow.
Someone in Australia was attending the Allegheny Nature Pilgrimage because of us.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah.
And I didn't this year. I didn't have the time for it. I was so busy. But yeah.
Me either. So, folks, thank you for all that support. We really do appreciate it. And we've been doing our best to be releasing episodes on a monthly basis. We will continue to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So thanks for listening, folks. We will see you next month, but stick around for a message from our sponsor.
All right, guys, so before we end the episode, we want to tell you about our sponsor, Gumleaf USA. So Gumleaf makes tall rubber boots. Bill and I both have our own pair.
And that makes me think of a question, Steve.
Yeah.
Are you a farmer?
I am growing tomatoes on my balcony.
That doesn't count.
What? I guess I'm not a farmer.
If you were...
Sorry, you're the gatekeeper for farming.
I am.
Okay.
And if you were a farmer, I would recommend Gumleaf boots as a perfect piece of footwear for farming duties.
Oh, absolutely.
Not to mention if you were a hunter or a forester, if you were a horse person, landscaper, surveyor.
Is that what they call themselves, horse people?
That's what I call them.
Nice to meet you. I'm a horse person.
You know the people I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And anglers as well.
Ooh, yeah.
I know we often mention what we use our Gumleaf boots for on air, things like herping and birding and botanizing, but they're perfect foot gear for any of those careers that I mentioned as well. They come in handy. They are made of 80% natural rubber, so they can bend many, many more times without cracking than those boots that may look the same and cost less but are not as high quality.
Yeah, let's throw a number out there. What, like a million? A million times or
They
more?
could bend maybe a million times or more without cracking. At least that's our anecdotal.
Yeah, right.
So where do people go to check out Gumleaf boots?
So all you have to do is you visit gumleafusa.com, and there is a special free shipping for our patrons. So
check that out in the episode notes.
Yeah.
All right, folks. Thank you, Gumleaf, and we will see you all next month.
See you guys.